Hey guys, it's Lance at Mac Sound Solutions, and today, after installing Windows 11, which was what my last video was about on my Mac Pro 5.1, we're going to do a little gaming. We're going to see what kind of frame rates I'm getting with my RX 6800 XT. So we're going to test out CyberPunk 2077, Resident Evil Village, and good old Tomb Raider. We'll do those three. And we'll just also try ray tracing turned on and turned off and see what kind of frame rates we're getting. But you know, I had Windows 10 on a spinning drive before, and now Windows 11 on an SSD is running super smooth. My frame rates might have even bumped up a little bit, but of course that probably coincided with getting a newer driver for the RX 6800 XT. Anyway, let's go check out the game, shall we? So we're going to try CyberPunk 2077 with my 2K 1440p monitor. It's locked at 60 Hertz. It's not a gaming monitor, but still gives you a good idea of what kind of performance we get with the Mac Pro 5.1 with an RX 6800 XT. This is running in native 2K mode. There is no FSR turned on, which should improve the frame rates when it is turned on. So I found that my screen capture software makes the frames per second take a bit of a hit. So it's about 4 to 5 frames you lose running the screen capture software. So we're getting about 80 frames per second at native resolution. And I just want to show this because there's a lot of naysayers out there saying putting a RX 6800 XT in your Mac Pro is a waste. But if you look at the benchmark of another YouTuber who does graphics cards all the time, you can see that he's only getting 88 frames per second with a gaming PC and an RX 6800 XT with a much more modern CPU. So I'm only 8 frames a second lower than his benchmark running at 1440p, which is pretty darn good for a 12-year-old machine. Now we're running it with FSR in quality mode. Ray tracing is still turned off, and we'll see what we get here. We get a little bump in frames per second, not massive, and it comes in at about 85 frames per second when you're not using the screen capture software. So if you compare my FSR results to the PC gamer, he's getting about 104 frames per second, and I'm only getting 85. So there's a big discrepancy there, and I think it comes down to having a more modern architecture as far as the CPU goes, and PCIe bus 3.0, etc. But the native resolution is very close. So there's something going on with FSR that needs a better CPU. So we'll do one more benchmark with ray tracing turned on, the ultra setting, and FSR in auto mode. Ray tracing just beats the hell out of your frames per second. I take a massive hit turning it on in ultra mode. It's almost half of what I get. And in native mode, it's unplayable. It's like 24 frames per second. So I'm just doing this with the FSR set to auto mode, which is the ray tracing ultra preset. And you can see without the screen capture software, I get about 54 frames per second. And that is playable at the ray tracing ultra preset. So, at 2K on a 12-year-old Mac Pro, that is pretty impressive. So with ray tracing turned on, having FSR made a huge leap in frames per second. So let's go into the game for a little bit and we'll mess around with the presets. And I do find I get more of a frames per second boost with FSR within the game as opposed to just running this benchmark. But it's totally playable in 1440p. You're going to average above 60 frames per second without any FSR on. So it really looks the best when you're in 1440p. But if you want to get more frames per second, turn on FSR, go into quality or auto mode, and you'll get some more frames. So we got another 5 to 10 frames per second. Not a major boost, and part of it is because I'm running the screen capture at the same time. It would actually go up a little more than it is right now, maybe up to 85 frames a second in auto FSR mode. Now we'll try the Ray Tracing Ultra preset. FSR is set to auto in the preset, and I'm just walking around in the city here, and you can see we're getting, we're averaging around 48, 50 frames per second. Now we'll turn off ray tracing and just have it in the ultra mode. And we're getting around 70 frames a second. Pretty good. And if you look at what people get when they're using the RX 6800 XT with a 4K monitor running in 4K, they get about the same frame rates I'm getting in 4K as opposed to 2K. But again, it's a 12-year-old CPU. So the fact that it's holding its own is pretty impressive. Excuse me, I would like your car. And that will wrap it up for CyberPunk 2077, and we'll move on to Resident Evil Village. So first we'll try it at 1440p max settings without ray tracing turned on. And as you can see, I'm getting 60 frames per second, and that's because I've got VSync turned on, which locks you at that frame rate. So now we're going to turn VSync off and see how we do. So we're hitting 130 frames per second, 120, pretty darn good. You know, when you have VSync turned on, that's probably the smoothest gameplay because you're locked at 60 frames per second, at least with my monitor, and it never drops below 60. It's just locked right on there. So without it turned on, you get more frames per second, but on a 60 hertz monitor, does it make sense? I'm not really sure. So now we're going to put ray tracing on, and unlike CyberPunk, it doesn't really hit the frame rate as much. You lose about 10 frames per second, but if that's pretty good. So let's go in and ramp up all the ray tracing settings and add ambient occlusion. Okay, so we're indoors with max settings on, and I'll just jump through a couple of different scenes I recorded, but you can see I'm getting over 100 frames per second with ray tracing and everything set to the max on an old Mac Pro 5.1 RX 6800 XT at 2K. You know what makes me a little crazy about these video games is the huge amount of settings they have. Why can't we just have low, medium, and high? You have ray tracing, you have ambient occlusion, you have anti-aliasing. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. You can spend your life tweaking your video settings. And on that note, we'll wrap up Resident Evil Village, and we'll move on to Tomb Raider. And I'm going to set everything pretty much to the max except for ray tracing. We'll start without ray tracing, and then we'll try it with ray tracing. So we'll just whip through this benchmark. And what's weird is, you know, it says 0 GPU bound when it finishes up here. And I think GPU bound 0% means it is not getting bottlenecked, and that it's the CPU that's getting bottlenecked. The CPU is utilized almost as much as the GPU. So now we'll set ray tracing to ultra and then run the benchmark again. And we come in at 74 frames per second on average, and you know, it's not a big performance hit. It's only about 6 frames. We had 81 without ray tracing. I notice when I'm playing in the game, I'm getting more near 90 to 100 frames per second, even with ray tracing turned on. And yeah, it drops down to 60 sometimes, and it goes over 100 sometimes. It just depends on where you are in the game, how much stuff is going on, indoors, outdoors, etc. So I thought we'd just take a look at the ray tracing on and the ray tracing off. Now, this was one of the first games to introduce ray tracing, and so it's not a big deal in this game. All it really does is soften the shadows and adds a few more reflections. What's weird to me is everybody has different clothes on. It's not consistent. Like the guy behind Laura right now, one guy on the left has the hat, same guy on the right doesn't have a hat. Different plaid shirt on the other guy, different dress on this woman, different outfit on the guy at the fountain. So how is the benchmark consistent if everybody's always wearing different outfits? It's just weird. And I think every time you run the benchmark, their clothes change, which is pretty funny. Now in this scene, if you look at the shadows on the ground, you'll see the difference between the ray traced and the non-ray traced, but it's very subtle. The ray trace shadows just look softer, a little more real. But other than that, it's not really adding anything to the game. I mean, the birds up there, the light coming through the trees, all looks pretty much the same. And again, it's called ray tracing shadows in this game. So, you know, maybe a little bit on the water you're going to see a difference. But if you need a few more frames per second, just turn ray tracing shadows off. You're not really going to have a different experience in the game at all. So again, in this scene, looking at the shadows from the left to the right, you can see the shadows are just a little more softer, maybe a little more real looking. But it's not night and day. And here we are again. Little boy, poncho on the left. Little boy, no poncho on the right. Guy on the left, no poncho. Guy on the right, poncho. So, I don't know why that is. It's weird. So we'll just check out the regular gameplay frame rate here with the ray tracing turned on. And you can see I'm getting up to 100 frames per second. 90s, 80s. Always fluctuating. But, you know, the game looks good. It plays super smooth. And
anything interesting in that new shipment?
Good old Mac Pro 5.1, still kicking ass. And Laura's kicking ass as well. She can be pretty vicious at times.
More good men down. Let's get her.
So we'll just play a little Doom Eternal as a final outro with the ray tracing turned on, see what kind of frame rate we're getting. It's usually always over 100, sometimes it dips a little below, sometimes it goes way above that. And again, ray tracing doesn't do that much for this game, you can turn it off. But heck, if I'm getting above 60 frames per second, I'm leaving the ray tracing turned on. And it's going to do me some bludgeoning. So long story short, the Mac Pro 5.1 with an RX 6800 XT is a nice little gaming machine for 2K gaming. You know, it might even work pretty well at 4K. I haven't tried it. Definitely going to get slower frame rates. But still might be playable. As long as you get that nice 60 frames per second, you're pretty good to go. Take that, Mac Studio, with your 64 GPU cores. An old Mac Pro 5.1 is still viable for AAA gaming. You know, you gotta look at how much time you put into playing games. I went and looked at one of the games, and you know, it kind of, Steam tracks the amount of time you play. And I was like, 45 hours. I'm like, man, that's just time gone sitting there at your computer staring at a screen and not making any money, not making any connections, not going out into the world, not meeting any ladies. I'm married, I don't have to do that. But you know, it's like they can suck your life away. Next thing you know, you're a geezer like me, 62 years old. You know, I can afford to play them now, but I'm glad these things weren't around when I was really young, or I would have probably spent way too much time playing games and not going out into the world. You know, when I grew up, there was no internet. There was no GPS. There was none of that stuff. You had to make phone calls on the phone, and you had to get out a map, figure out where you were going, and, you know, communicate with people, not with people over the internet, which is a completely different thing. So don't play games all the time. They're fun every once in a while, but don't waste your life away playing games. There's too much good stuff out there, and there's too much to accomplish, and there's money to be made. So, you know, if you're a programmer and you're making games, great. But if you're just sitting on your ass playing games all day, that's a recipe for disaster. It's like a drug. It's like drinking. Don't do it all too much, or else it'll become a problem. That's Data Lance talking to you. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you on the next Mac Sound Solutions video.